This is the audio lecture for Chapter 7 out of the Nye text. And the title of this chapter is Work More or Less, Better or Worse. In terms of the structure of the chapter title, Nye is really throwing us a monkey wrench this week with that colon in there. And then, following the colon, two different choices that we can ponder in relationship to work. Does technology give us more work or does it give us less work? And by virtue of technology, is the work that we have better quality work or is it worse quality work? And so these are the sorts of questions that we are pondering here in Chapter 7. And so the overall basic idea of Chapter 7 is in relationship to technology and work. And we're going to look at these four different topics in this lecture in relation to technology and work. We're going to start by looking at technology and work processes, um, the sorts of things, the way that the process of work goes in connection with technology and how it has changed. We're going to learn a little bit about something called scientific management. And then also about something called the technocracy movement. Both of these were historical developments in relationship to the interaction of technology and work in the early 20th century. And then finally, I'll close with a discussion of a concept called technological unemployment. So I'll start with this idea of technology and work processes. And this is something that sort of weaves throughout Chapter 7 that Nye talks about at a couple of different points. But basically, the through line is the evolution of work processes as a result of different developments in technology. And the first piece of this is that in the pre-industrial period, meaning prior to the Industrial Revolution, work processes that people had that at this time did not involve machines of any kind, or at least not mechanical machines in the way that we think of machines now. At this time, work processes had very distinct rhythms. If you think about the rhythm that a weaver might have or the rhythm that a blacksmith might have, these sorts of work, or for that matter, harvesting crops as well, these sorts of work had distinct rhythms to them. And pre-industrial workers had learned to go about doing these sorts of work by following these rhythms and by incorporating these rhythms and doing their work in a rhythmic fashion, especially when they were doing it in the context of working with a group of people. Now, sometimes these rhythms were actually musical in nature. Nye talks in a little bit of detail about how many types of work groups and many different types of work processes actually used musical rhythms to accomplish their work, whether this was people, sometimes slaves in America, working in fields to harvest crops of different kinds, whether it was, sorts of mechanical workers. Uh, Many times they actually sang songs or used musical rhythms, sometimes percussive type rhythms, to regulate and sort of operate the work process that they were involved in. Now, when factory work emerged and then later assembly line production emerged, that sort of made these rhythms disappear when mechanical machines, started to do the work, or people started to do the work in conjunction with or using machines or mechanical contraptions. They no longer had the kind of control over their work rhythms that they had before. The rhythms were dictated by the machines that they were using to work, and then later on, in terms of the assembly line, an assembly line works or runs at a certain pace, and it was that pace or that rhythm that dictated the work process rather than the sorts of rhythms that pre-industrial and pre-assembly line workers had much more flexibility in terms of determining what their work rhythms were. Work processes in the pre-industrial, meaning before machines, and then the early industrial period, meaning when factories had appeared, but before the assembly line had appeared. These work processes were often very idiosyncratic. Now, that term idiosyncratic means that uh, every individual did it a little bit differently. That word idiosyncratic or idiosyncrasy is one you may have heard before, and it's often used to describe people. Oh, he's a little idiosyncratic. It means he's a little different, does things in his own way. And that's the way that work processes were to a certain extent in the pre-industrial and early industrial period. Um, Individuals did the same work process in different ways. And oftentimes this meant that many of the people doing these work processes were doing them in a very inefficient fashion because everybody was sort of able to engage in their work process however they wanted to, using whatever steps and whatever movements they wanted to. There was a lot of waste involved, wasted time, wasted movement, and sort of just wasted elements of the work process. Well, one of the things that scientific management did was to eliminate all of these idiosyncrasies, to eliminate the variation in work processes that different people had. Scientific management attempted to figure out the best way to do a particular work process and then have everybody that did that particular work process do it in exactly the same way. And I'll speak more about scientific management in just a few moments. Moving a little bit more into the present time and recent times, computer technologies and information technologies have allowed new possibilities for employers and supervisors to monitor employees' work and to really have surveillance of employees' work. Now, we know that term surveillance mostly from the idea of surveillance cameras. And in some cases, surveillance cameras are in operation with these technologies in the workplace today, but more than that, it is computer or digital technologies that allow for much closer monitoring and surveillance of work. The amount of time that it takes a worker to do something, the process by which by which a worker does something, and whether or not the worker makes mistakes and how many and what nature of mistakes in the work process are all things that are able to be monitored now in many cases, in many sorts of work situations by employers and by supervisors. And as a byproduct of this, there is often a lot of data that is produced, data that is collected automatically by the computer and surveillance and monitoring technologies that are in play. And so this data can be used for employee evaluations. How well is a person doing their job, and are they doing it the way that they're supposed to be doing it? can be used for trying to improve the work processes, eliminating inefficiencies and eliminating additional waste and finding opportunities to just improve the work process. And analysis of all kinds of different in all kinds of different fashions, including the cost analysis and other things of that sort, are made possible now through the sorts of technologies that are available through computer and information technologies in general. And this process, as it has operated in recent years and operates now, is something that Nye talks about in Chapter 7 and the later parts of the chapter. One of the key ideas related to the historical development of technology and work is a set of ideas or a set of principles called scientific management. Scientific management. And scientific management first emerged just about a century ago, just about 100 years ago, in 1911 with a book called Principles of Scientific Management, which was written by a person named Frederick Winslow Taylor. Taylor was a work process consultant. And at this time, in the early 1900s, the first decade or so of the 1900s, factories had been around for 100 years or so, a little more maybe in some respects. But in factories, many of the work processes were still very inefficient and had a relatively low degree of productivity. And this was before assembly lines were introduced, which happened shortly after the publication of Taylor's book. And so the core of Taylor's concept of scientific management was that for any particular work process, there was one best way to do that process or to go about executing that process. And so his theory of scientific management and the practice of scientific management, which was put into practice in a great many different sorts of contexts in things other than factory work. It was put into process in things like the domestic kitchen, in terms of office work, as well as factory work, and then very soon after 1911 in assembly lines as well. The idea was that there was one best way to do that work process that involved the least possible amount of waste, the least possible movements, the least possible amount of time. And so the goals of scientific management eliminate was to eliminate any kind of waste in the amount of time that a work process took, in the number of movements that were involved in a work process, in the amount of materials that were necessary to go through a work process. And so trying to make any particular work process as efficient and as productive as possible. So this whole set of principles of scientific management gained the nickname or the alternative name of Taylorism, named after, of course, Frederick Winslow Taylor himself. And this movement of Taylorism sort of dovetailed with assembly line production, which was emerging at almost exactly the same time, just a few years after the publication of Taylor's book in 1911. In about the mid-19 teens is when Henry Ford began his assembly line production system in his automobile plants. And so this whole idea of Taylorism, although initially it was, separate from the idea of an assembly line, and The idea of assembly line was developed sort of independently of these principles of scientific management. The two sets of principles were sort of combined or merged together in the rise of assembly line production starting in the mid 19 teens. So the scientific management movement and the whole rise of ideas uh, concerned with scientific management took place in the mainly in the decade of the 19 teens. And through the teens and then the 1920s, assembly line production and all of these sorts of related principles of scientific management came to be at the very center of American society and at the very center of American manufacturing and American mass production systems. By the end of the 1920s, um, assembly lines and mass production using assembly lines in scientific management uh, had become the mainstream of American society. And so at this time, in the late 1920s and early 1930s, another movement began, which was called the technocracy movement. The technocracy movement. Now, technocracy is sort of a coined word. The first part of it, techno, of course, is derived from the word technological or technology. And the second part, the crassy, technocracy, is derived from the word bureaucracy. And what technocracy was an idea that, at this point where assembly line production and scientific management had gotten at the center or just arrived at the center of American society, that the next logical step, so argued the people promoting technocracy, was that the engineers and managers who were technologically proficient and had knowledge of the technology should not just be involved in the production processes, but in fact, that these people should control society in general. That American society ought to be run by the engineers and the technicians, the technologically sophisticated people that had recently come to be at the center of American manufacturing and American mass production. And so, one of the core ideas behind technocracy was that all of society should be reorganized around the needs of technologically based production. That, uh, things like capitalism and democracy ought to be subordinated to uh, the needs of mass production, that was the most important thing in American society, that everything ought to be organized in such a way to facilitate and prioritize mass production using the new sorts of technologies of assembly line production and scientific management, and that the engineers and technological managers ought to be the people who are in charge of all of that, and by extension, in charge of American society. Now, the period that technocracy was an active movement in the early and mid 1930s was um, a very unsettled period of American history. As you know, a good part of the 1930s was involved with the Great Depression. The Great Depression was occurring in the 1930s, and especially in the early 1930s, the period between 1930 and 1933, after the Depression had begun in the fall of 1929, but before Franklin Delano Roosevelt became president in early 1933. There was a great deal of social unrest and possibilities for various sorts of revolution and other sorts of social uprising in America, just because of how bad the economic conditions were and how volatile American society was. So it was within this period of the early 1930s that this technocracy movement sort of took root and had some popularity among different parts of American society for a short period. The last concept that I'm going to talk about in this lecture, and that is one of the core concepts of Chapter 7 in Nye, is the idea of technological unemployment. Technological unemployment. Now, just looking at the word, you probably can make a pretty good guess as to what technological unemployment is. Unemployment is of course when people lose their jobs or are unable to get a job, and technological unemployment is when that happens because of technology or because of different factors related to technology. So the sort of working definition that I am offering for technological unemployment is the elimination of jobs or job categories due to advancing technology. And there's a lot of different sorts of things involved here. And technological unemployment is something that has been a constant to one extent or another through much of history. Certainly, it was something that was taking place during the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s. It was something that was taking place in the early 1900s, the early decades of the 1900s, the periods that I've just been speaking about when scientific management and the assembly line and technocracy were all new ideas. And it's something that's taking place even today and in recent years. There's technological unemployment that takes place or occurs due to new technologies and advancing technologies. Now, there's a number of different ways that technological unemployment can occur, or a number of different forms that technological unemployment can take. One of them is that technology improves the efficiency of working processes or of machinery. And as a result of that, not as many workers are necessary as used to be the case. So uh, with a particular set of machinery or in a particular part of an assembly line in a factory where maybe it used to require 15 workers to work on that particular area. Maybe now, because of the way that technology has improved the machinery and the efficiency, maybe now only 10 people are required for that particular area that used to require 15 people. Another variation is that new machines or improved machines, actually do all of the work that people used to do. And so particular jobs just no longer exist because machinery of one kind or another is doing the work that a person used to do. And then another variation is that particular types of work just simply disappear for one reason or another. Maybe because society progresses and the type of work that that category represented just no longer exists because what it is no longer exists anymore. There's a few examples that Nye talks about in respect to different kinds of technological unemployment. One of them is in relation to tellers and ATMs or automatic teller machines. ATMs became popular and began to be widespread in the 1980s, and as a result of them, banks did not have a need for as many bank tellers as they maybe used to need before the spread of ATMs. Going back a little further in history, when the mechanical loom was first developed for weaving, um, it took the place of the jobs of many weavers. When weaving was a manual type of thing, it required a great many more workers actually doing the weaving than were required when mechanical looms were introduced. In accounting as a field, many jobs there have been either replaced or downsized because of the fact that accounting is much less labor intensive than it used to be. Accountants and their assistants used to have to enter in accounting information in paper ledgers that are like large books, and actually physically write all that down and do calculations by hand, and so forth. Whereas now, a great deal of accounting work is done by computer with software and is done automatically in terms of calculations and that sort of thing. And then finally, there was a whole category of jobs of silent movie musicians. In the early decades of motion pictures, between the 1890s and the 1920s, uh, the technology of movies had not advanced to the point yet where a synchronized soundtrack was possible. And in almost all movie theaters, a live musical score was played along with the movie, which means that while the movie was playing and was being projected in the theater, there actually would be a musician or a group of musicians right there in the theater that played a live musical score to accompany the movie. And so this provided jobs for musicians that after sound movies came in, synchronized sound movies began to appear in the 1920s, in a process that was basically complete by the year 1930. All of these musicians that used to have jobs playing for scores of silent movies no longer had jobs, and that whole job category simply disappeared. One of the things, though, as a closing note, one of the things that Nye is very careful to emphasize, and which is an important thing to remember and understand about technological unemployment, is that technology has created jobs just as much as it has eliminated them. New technologies have eliminated a lot of different jobs and job categories, but technology has also created new jobs and new job categories that didn't exist before. The whole field or discipline of information technology is perhaps the easiest to think of and the most widespread in terms of job categories that were created by new technology. So, technological unemployment is one of the core concepts of the relationship between work and technology that Nye talks about in Chapter 7, and which you will learn more about when you read Chapter 7 this week.